this week, what I want to talk about, and the whole sermon title and everything, is unlocking your potential, right? Going beyond your excuses. How many of you know we all have excuses? We have excuses for everything. And we get intertwined into that, and a lot of times we miss what God's wanting to do or trying to do in us because of that. And because of those types of excuses that we have in our lives and everything. And so one of the things we deal with just in society, I don't know if you've noticed, but everything tends to be unraveling, right? I mean, look at the world we're seeing now. You're seeing it happened even, I think it was in South Bend. But you're seeing people that's just reading the Word of God on a sidewalk, public property, being arrested. That's in America. I know of 2 cases that's already happened. And you see all kinds of things now coming down the pipe in Canada. You're seeing all kinds of things in Europe. I mean, you could just, and a lot of them, there's one lady that's in a lot of trouble over there. I don't know if she's parliament or what she's in, but she's a high-level person. She's in all kinds of trouble just because she tweeted something or shared a tweet or something like that. And so, I mean, she's like being sued, and we just had a group of individuals that were charged. Now they've been convicted because all they did was they were singing songs and talking about Jesus at an abortion clinic. They weren't impeding anybody to get to anywhere. They could still get in there, whatever they needed, arrested. Now they're all facing 11 years in prison for that. Do you know why that happens? It's so the enemy can build an excuse in you to not stand up for God, to not be a Christian, to not stand up and say this is wrong. That's what all those things are tactics to keep Christians silent. To give us one more excuse to use of why we don't serve God or live for God. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. I know we have excuses, and this is kind of a sermon where I'm going to hit it from a biblical view and things of that as usual. But this, excuses apply in our everyday life. Not just, how we serve God or things like that. But in our everyday life, we deal with excuses. We have excuse why we don't want to get up and go to church on Sunday morning, right? I'm tired. I worked late last night. I want to go to the lake. Well, my kids really don't like it. So they're all excuses as to why we don't want to do something. That's just something simple. We do it at work. We do it, hey, I'm going to call in today. Why? I just don't feel like going in. Or so-and-so made me mad yesterday, and so I don't want to go. That's your excuse. That's your justification. And so we deal with it. But as Christians, I want to encourage you. I realize as time goes on, and as problems increase, and as this world continues to slide down into deeper, deeper trenches, it's going to take people to be able to stand up, and it may cost you. It may cost you dearly. But I'm telling you, in the end, it is worth it to stand up for God versus use an excuse why not to serve God. And we're going to talk about that some today. And just so I want to encourage you not to shrink back, but to step up. My saying, step up, step out, step in. God does reward that and our faithfulness to Him. But I do promise you, what will happen, Satan will come along, and he's going to bring things in, just like the intimidation factor I was just talking about, and he's going to tempt you with an excuse of why not to serve God. Yeah. He's going to tell you every habit you've ever had. He'll use every wrong thing you've ever said, how wretched of a person you may have ever been in your life, and he'll use that to his advantage to give you an excuse. Well, God couldn't love me. I've done this, and I've done that, and I've done that. Why would He love me? Why would God want to use me? Look at all of what I've done. The Bible is full of accounts of people who are just like you and who are just like me, that were messed up, that did wrong things. We're going to talk about Moses today. Moses killed a man, killed an Egyptian man. So don't think that God can never use you. Don't allow that to become an excuse. We need to be more like Isaiah and say, yes, Lord, send me. Yes, Lord, send me. I know you're going to be inundated with all kinds of things. And the enemy wants to give you every excuse in the world. But we have to move forward in our faith. We can't just talk about it. We have to exercise it. It's just like a muscle in the body. We exercise our muscles because then they grow stronger and they enable you to do more, and it is as laborsome and everything else because you've been strengthened. That's what your faith does. Exercising that faith through life, through church, through just everyday experiences, increases that faith that you have. And it allows you to go further and further with God. So as I'd said, and I'd started off, I want to talk about Moses today. Because, you and I, we see the Bible and we see the patriarchs of the Bible, and we see them as like, I could never be like that. I mean, my gosh, Moses parted the Red Sea. Moses takes a stick and strikes a rock, and water comes flowing out, and 2 million people are watered. So, it wasn't just a little trickle. Like, how could I be that? Look at all the miracles of Elijah and Elisha and all that. It's like, who am I, God? Why would you use me? But we're going to look at that from that standpoint of realizing, yeah, God chose them and tapped them on the shoulder to do some miraculous things. But they were just men. They were just human beings like you and like me. But one thing is all of them eventually, they stood with God, regardless of what was happening. And so we're going to look at Moses a little bit today. Even in James, you don't have this one, Chris, but even in James 5:17, it says, Elijah was a human being, even as we are. But he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain in the land for 3.5 years. So the Bible's telling you right there, he was just a normal guy. But he was willing to obey God. How willing are we to obey God? And to stand strong and stand with him and walk with him. And so, we know the story, Moses, the burning bush, and God speaking to him, and he's telling him all these things, and he was 40, and then he goes the backside of the desert, 40 more years. So, Moses is like 80 years old before all this stuff starts. You remember the movie 10 Commandments and all of that and everything. Well, when Moses comes out to do all this and everything, he's like 80 years old. He wasn't some spring chicken. But he was encouraged and empowered through God, through his Spirit, because he was going to use Moses to do something in a miraculous way. But he's been on the backside of this desert for 40 years. If any of, however many in here, or those that are watching, doing the play-at-home version here, 40 years is a long time. How many things that you did 40 years ago you don't do now? How much have you matured? How much have you forgotten in 40 years? Huh? Most in here, and most probably watching this, you haven't been removed from school for 40 years yet. But you still remember algebra and geometry and calculus? You probably sit down and go, what? Because you've forgotten things. So imagine Moses. Here he knows that God has this plan for him. He's on the backside of the desert. But now with all the things that's went on with Moses and him being chased down and everything else, now he's in a place, and I'm trying to relate this to us, he's in a place of just feeling his failures in life. Feeling all those things, his shortcomings and his inferiorities. Surely everybody in here can relate to that at times in their life where you've just sat around and that's how you feel. Feel like you haven't accomplished anything. You feel like you haven't went anywhere. And maybe even it came on, you thought when you were saved and you thought God was really speaking to you and you thought that God really wanted to do something in you. And here it's been 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, whatever it may be. And it seems like God still isn't doing anything. And so then all those shortcomings come in, all those feelings of failure, all those feelings of God can't use me, all those things to keep you, just like in the beginning of this where I talked about how those things are done to keep Christians down. So we don't stand up for our beliefs, so we don't stand up for our God. That's exactly how Satan used it here. Many of us feel that way. Many of us in our walk find ourselves at some point being in that position where all we see are our shortcomings. We don't see how God can use us. Now, we can see how He could use someone else, even if their life has been much more what seemingly tragic than ours. Well, yeah, I'm sure God could use them, so-and-so, for this or so-and-so for that, but not me. It isn't for me. And so here he is filled with inferiority complex, being insecure, just like you, just like me. Moses' response, when you get into the scriptures in Exodus, we won't read them all, but everything's about I, me, me, me. Why is that? Because as a general rule, think about every time you throw out an excuse. Okay? That's what I'll preface this with. Think about that. Every time you throw out an excuse is why? It's because you're focused on yourself. It's because it's all about you. Every excuse, just think about it when you've used one. Every excuse is about to feed something in you because it's about you. Whether your excuse is about to avoid something or to be involved in something, whatever it may be, it's because it's self-centered. Excuses are self-centered emotions and feelings that we act on. But we have to get to a place where we understand that power of God. And we begin to follow the power of God like we're going to see Moses do instead of following the power of the excuse in our life. Because that's what the world wants you to follow. Because that is all generated through our emotions, through our feelings, and by Satan pushing us in the direction of our excuses. And we have to understand that God truly does have a purpose in our lives. I said Moses killed a man, but God had a purpose for him. As far as I know, there isn't anyone in here that's ever killed anybody, but yet God still used Moses. And He'll use you. Because He has a calling on your life and He has a calling on everybody's life. Remember, we walk by faith, not by sight. Most of your excuses are wound up in things you can see. Because it's usually things you don't want to do. An excuse typically is something you don't want to do. Sometimes it'll be something, well, I use this excuse because I wanted that. But still, that's what they're all cased in, I guess I should say. But when we find ourselves in faith, and when we find ourselves following faith and following God, He, just like with Moses, He can remove every obstacle in your life that you could ever imagine. He can take you beyond anything you could ever imagine. He will take you places and help you with things and bless you in certain ways when you're faithful to Him. This is a matter of obedience, and it's a matter of that love and that change in your life that causes you to yearn to seek out God. Once again, like most everything started in the garden. I know through our marriage series, there's a lot of things I showed you and pointed out started right in Genesis. Did this not as well? What did God tell Adam and Eve? He said, hey, you can eat of anything in this place. The only thing you can't do, you can't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What'd they do? They ate of it, didn't they? So still, they're being rebellious. They're going against God. They do it, and then remember, God was walking in the garden. And all of a sudden, he calls out for Adam. He's like, where are you? And Adam was hiding. He says, why are you hiding? He said, well, I was naked. And I was scared. What did God say? He said, who told you you were naked? So God already knew. But then what happened? When God begins to question, what did Adam do? What was that woman you gave me? Came out with an excuse, didn't he? And so he goes to Eve. And what does she tell him? It was that serpent. It was his fault. Another excuse. They didn't own it. They excused it. This started all the way in the garden, folks. Why did it start? Because if you read in Genesis 2:25, he tells you, he says that they were naked, but they weren't afraid. It didn't bother them. So what does that tell you? The excuses and the issues came in when sin entered into us. Didn't happen before then. The excuse came when sin came in. And that's where we're at today. But those excuses in our life, they expose the self-centeredness of who we are. And every one of us are. We have to come to that place of living under the power of God rather than the power of the excuse. So, I'm going to give you 4 things, and then I'm going to end out with one that really isn't just blatantly out there, but it's inferred in the end. But Moses, when he's talking to him, let me give you the scripture. We'll read it first. Exodus 3:13. Then this is the ESV here. It says, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? See, his first excuse is, I don't have all the answers. I don't know everything. So surely you wouldn't want to use me. I wouldn't even know what to say, God. You know, when you're feeling all this pressure, the workplace and society and culture and everything to hold you down so you don't stand up for God, so you don't stand up for your Christian beliefs. Folks, it's easy to stand up and be a good little Christian when you come to church. It's easy to shout and praise and do all that and listen to the word and everything. It's a different scenario and aspect of your life when it comes to applying it when you walk out these doors. And you're going to have all kinds that are going to come against you to push you down and hold you down. And then going to make you feel like, well, I couldn't witness to this one. I couldn't say anything to that one. I can't be this strong person in my workplace or in my, circles of friends or my family or whatever, because I don't have all the answers. Many of us let that be one of our excuses. Well, what if they start asking me about God? And I don't know what to tell them. I just know kind of, I believe and I have faith and all of this. And I don't know. I'm not educated in the Bible. I don't know all those different type of things. But it isn't about having all the answers. You realize that? It isn't about having all the answers. It's about having that love of God inside of you and being able to convey that. And there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do know. When I finally said yes to Jesus and he began to change my life, you will be amazed at all the things that begin to change. Oh, it didn't make everything perfect. I still struggled with this temptation and I still struggled with that temptation. But what I did know is I knew that he loved me. And it keeps me anchored in him. And I keep striving to get closer and closer to him. And that's what's turned my world around. You didn't give any kind of theological statement, dissertation, or anything. You didn't have to come from seminary to be able to say that to someone. You just spoke from the heart. You just loved them from the heart. But that's the first thing that Moses comes out with in to God is that I don't have all the answers. In 14 says, so God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. What else is he telling him? He's telling him, I'll tell you what to say. I'll put it in your heart. You know, one thing I always loved when I was a kid, and you know, people that's watching this or whatever, don't get all offended. We all know how that goes. Everybody's offended over everything nowadays. But I loved it when, you know, someone would begin to pray. And they begin to pray, you know, out loud and things like this. And they begin to pray in a King James dialect. Like, what? You just got to talk to God. You realize they didn't talk that way then. That wasn't how they talked. So, but it was trying to conform to something so that it sounded more spiritual and sounded more prominent, that they knew what they were doing, because this is the speech of God that I'm praying out loud to you. So wrong. And what I'm saying, the reason I'm saying that is, you don't have to conform to something that you think is the way you have to say something or know something or understand something or minister to somebody by manipulating yourself to act a certain way. All God cares about is your heart. Because it's your heart, you realize it's your heart that saves you. It's your heart bowing before God with that repentant heart, believing in Him and what He did on Calvary. That is what it's all about. He's not looking for everybody to be a seminary student or graduate. Okay? Don't feel inferior to standing up, being able to stand up for God. Don't feel inferior because of your lack of knowledge. Okay? Lead with your heart. Let God, through the Spirit, move you through your heart. Because the most important thing, church, let's say it this way, church has a lot of tentacles. It has a lot of organizational garbage, as I say. It has a lot of fluff and stuff. Church in general. Don't get mesmerized by all of that and get locked down into a certain way that things have to be done to be able to love someone and minister to them. Because the most important, even with all those tentacles, the most important thing to God is not your Rolls Royce, is not your 3-story house, is not your swimming pool, it's not, how great of a vehicle you drive. God's only care in the world, regardless of what you hear these people on TV tell you, His only care in the world is that you are saved and He sees you in the kingdom of heaven. And if that means you got to go through hell on earth to break you, to get you to that point, then it is worth it to God. Stop blaming Him, because He very well may be trying to help you and put things in your path and allow things in your path to get you to bow before His throne and come to Him. Because in our own selfishness and our own arrogance, we like to do things our way. Yeah. And God continually shows in His Word, no, it will be my way. All of your stuff is going to leave you one day. I was joking with a guy at work the other day. I said, isn't it crazy about life insurance? I said, I pay into it, and I pay into it, and I pay into it, and I pay into it, just so I can die and someone else can spend it. Isn't that amazing? But the thing with that is, I do have an insurance policy with God. That one day I'll get to spend that. I'll get the reward of that. And You know, too many times we're worried about everything that this world has to offer. And I'm telling you, it's wood, hay, and stubble. The Bible tells us that. It will be gone. I'm telling you, folks, we're going down a path right now in this world. You're going to see a lot of things that you take for granted that soon aren't going to be there, especially with your freedoms. You're seeing it day by day, little by little. This world is that frog, that proverbial frog in the pot that's slowly getting the heat turned up, and eventually it gets cooked and it never jumped out of the pot. I was talking to a brother today. I said, you know, one of the hardest things as a pastor is when you warn and you warn and you warn, just like in the days of Noah, and he warned them. He warned them, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. Get right with God, get right with God, get right with God. And we do it over and over and over, and people still don't listen. That's hard as a pastor, because you're called to love people, and you're called to love them to Christ and be there for them. And it's so disheartening when you see everything and the whole thing is a big picture and people don't want anything to do with it. That's hard. That's definitely difficult. Let me move on to the second thing. Exodus 4:1. Then Moses answered, but behold, now this is God. Now remember, I didn't really preface this, but this is God. He's at the burning bush and he's giving Moses, he's telling him all the things that he's going to be needing to do to let his people go out of Egypt and bondage of the Egyptians. He says, but behold, they will not believe me. This is Moses. They will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they'll say, the Lord did not appear to you. So what's this excuse? What if they don't believe me? You know what he's playing on here? It's a thing that plays on you and it plays on me. Because this is from the beginning of time. Rejection. Rejection. Nobody likes the feeling of rejection. That's what Moses is dealing with. What if they reject me? What if they don't believe me? But here's a kicker. Exodus 3:18. Do you have that one? He says, and they will listen, this is God. Now he's talking to Moses. This is before, we're in chapter 4. This is chapter 3. He says, and they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt, say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to our Lord our God. You know what that tells you? He's not listening to God. God's already told him they'll listen to you, but he couldn't see it. He was leaning on his excuses. He wasn't listening to God. How many times do we not listen to God? Because he didn't move when we thought he should move. See, God may have told you something and promised you something in your heart through the Spirit that he was going to do something in your home, your marriage, your workplace, your work, or whatever. And it hasn't happened in 5 years. It hasn't happened in 10 years. Remember, Moses is in the desert for 40 years. I'm sure he doesn't believe it's happening at this point. But God told him they'll listen to you. But he wasn't listening. You do that and I do that. So I'm telling you to stand on that. He's trying to take and do everything in his own strength rather than allowing God to move in him and through him. And I encourage you today, get out of God's way. Let God work in you and through you, in your life, in family's life, in your friend's life, and allow him to do those things that only God can do, that only God can move through. We know that with Moses, with all of his problems and everything that's happened, you can understand why Moses feels this way. After all the things that he's done and all the roads he's went down. So what I'm saying is I understand and God understands why you feel the way you feel and the excuses that you have. But just like with Moses, every step of the way, God gave an answer. Do you remember in the story where God asked Moses, he says, what's in your hand? Basically says that stick, staff, stick, throw it down. Moses throws the stick down. It turns into a snake. It even says that Moses runs back, scares him. He says, grab it by the tail, stretch it out. Turns back into a staff. And then he goes on, because he's telling him through all this whole thing. Well, what if they don't listen to me? He goes, let me show you something. They're going to listen to you because let me show you what I'm going to do in your life. Let me show you how I'm going to use you in your life. Let me show you how I'm going to transform you into a powerhouse for me if you'll just listen to me, if you'll get away from your own self, if you'll stop just listening to yourself and you listen to me and you follow me. And that's what he's telling us today. And he says, take your hand, he said, put it in your cloak. Pull it out. It's full of leprosy. Leprosy in that day, that was a death sentence. You were dying. He says, now put it back in. Puts it back in. Takes it out and it's restored. Now tell me they won't listen to you. When they see what I can do, that I am the God Jehovah, and that what I can do in your life, what I can go above and exceedingly anything that you could ever do, think of, or imagine that you could do, and I am going to do that with this in the front of Pharaoh. Ladies and gentlemen, if God can do that with a stick, why do we continually think that He can't do something through us or in us? A stick. But He works through the miraculous. His third excuse, Exodus 4:10. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent. Either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." So now he's moved on to, I don't have all the right words. I don't speak well. I'm slow of speech. Most scholars believe that Moses had some sort of stuttering issue. It doesn't really go beyond it with this right here. After all this, instead of Moses falling on his knees and believing in and worshiping in and everything that God is miraculously doing, now he falls back on an infirmity that he has, as if God can't work through that. He just turned a stick into a snake. But he's afraid that God can't work through his stutter. We have still today a miracle-working God. He's still on the throne. He's still using people and doing things miraculously when He decides He wants to show off for whatever reason that He wants to. But this just gave Moses another excuse. He's worried about how hard it is to get the words out. Look in 4:11 and 4:12 here. It says, "Then the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I'll be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." That's powerful. There's two things too. Did you notice? What did he say there too? You see, we like to give the devil all this power. What did he say? He said, who made the mouth? Who made someone deaf? Who made someone mute? Who made them blind? In other words, who allowed them to be that? He said, I did. But it's for His purpose. We don't always know why. But we need to, in our lives, stop giving the devil so much power. I hear Christians talk more about the devil than they do about God. When are we going to get past that? You know, when are we going to stand up and and stand for God and for what's right and all that, instead of worrying about everything the devil can do or may do or this or that. And I remember one time, and boy, when I did this and I started doing that and everything, well, then the devil, blah, blah, blah. Come on, man. Stand up for God. That's what Moses is having a problem with. He needs to stand with God versus every excuse of why not to. God's telling Moses, you don't need to worry about this. I have it. Stop with the excuses. He goes on the fourth thing, so I can keep it moving here. In verse 4:13, he says, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." Then the NLT, it actually tells you, "Lord, send anyone else." Have you not been there? We'll use the workplace. Boss asks you to do this, and you're like, "Oh man, can't you just ask somebody else to do that? I don't know enough about XYZ over here. I shouldn't be the one doing that. Won't you have Joe over here go and handle that and do that?" Or, "Hey, I need you to deal with this issue and this employee here, and need you to take care of this. You know, it's in your purview of your job and everything." You're like, "Well, I mean, can't you send, he's in management too. Can't you just send him to deal with it? He deals with people much better than me." Send somebody else. Or here's another problem that we have. You have this in church. Let's say it's you got a Bible group, or you got a small group or something, and then it's like, maybe you even say yes to it. Maybe you go, "Okay, yeah, I'll lead that, or I'll do that this week." And then you're there and you realize there's plenty of people around you that know a lot more than you do. They have more knowledge. They have more understanding. They've been doing it longer. They've been a Christian longer. Can't somebody else do this? Why? I'm not qualified. Stop worrying about being qualified and start worrying about being obedient and allowing God to work in you and through you. He'll help you with that. He'll bring you forward in that. Put your nose in the Word. Gain an understanding. See, that's the thing about humanity. We sit back and we all look for our excuses and our problems, but we don't ever really like to look for the solutions. And I'm telling you, in so many things, if you get in the Word of God, you will find so many solutions to the problems that you have in your life every day. We've been dealing with them in family and marriage. It's right there in the Word of God. The problem is we don't want to listen to God. We want to arrogantly do it ourselves, and we think we know better than God. And so we want to do it that way. But you realize through all these excuses and these 4 excuses that I just gave you that Moses himself dealt with, that you and I deal with in life. Something that you have to understand when it comes to God. The more excuses you give and the longer you give excuses, you bring yourself into a position of rebellion with God. You are now instead of operating in obedience, you are operating in rebellion. Because what you're saying is, you're saying, "God, I don't agree with you." You're saying, "God, I know better than you do." You're saying, "God, yeah, I know your word and everything, but, I want to live my life how I want to live my life." But then we want to sit back and cry about everything in our life and whine about it because everything's so bad and everything's so upside down, never realizing the solution is turning your heart to God. Doesn't mean you don't have problems, but I'm telling you, you go through those problems in a much different way with God than without God. And we find ourselves in that place of rebellion, caught up in our feelings of inferiority, our feelings of insecurity, our feelings of just being humiliated in life and all those different things, and we begin to rebel against God. The Bible also tells us in 1 Samuel, this is a New Living Translation, 1 Samuel 15:23. Here's why this is so important. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft. And stubbornness is as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have, this was Samuel talking to the king, Saul, and because he had sinned against God. It says, because you've rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. This is towards his demise. But he's telling you, this is how serious to God our rebellion to him is. This isn't just fun stuff to God. This isn't God where he just turns his head and goes, oh, okay, you're right, Darren, I'll just ask somebody else to do it. See, that's how you and I work. That's how we deal with things. But that isn't how God deals with things. Now I'm going to go into the last thing, just because there is an implied issue, applied friction. I thought it'd be good to include this just coming out of our whole marriage and family stuff that we've been talking about. You're going to find many times, and you see this with many Christians today, is there's this problem of being unequally yoked. And you have one that's wanting to serve God with anything and everything that they have and go all out, and then you have the other spouse who doesn't want anything to do with God, who's an unbeliever, who could care less about God. And that's because of being unequally yoked. Do you remember when I told you in the marriage stuff? The problem with marriage nowadays is that we get married on feelings and emotions, not with any understanding of a covenant marriage. And then it has ramifications. There's problems with that as it transpires. Now, here's the worst thing. I know most of us in here, we've had kids, or maybe you do have kids, but those that will be watching, if you have kids, this is where the problem really begins to shine. Because when you begin to have kids, now you have to decide who's going to compromise. This one doesn't want anything to do with God. This one wants everything to do with God. Now, how are we going to raise our kids? More times than not, the one that follows Christ, believes in Christ and all that, will be the one that will compromise. Compromise to keep the peace. The ones that suffer from that for a lifetime are your children. Because it isn't all about feelings. We have to be careful for that. Those of you that may be thinking about marriage and things of that nature, about being unequally yoked, is detrimental to your family. It's huge. In John 3:18, Jesus said, red letter edition here, he says, whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Here's what I'm saying with that. When you're unequally yoked with a believer and an unbeliever, you have to remember the unbeliever is already condemned. Yeah. And all the problems and all the things that come along with that are coming into your marriage. Yeah. They're dragging it with them. They're bringing it with them. Now, here's the problem. Here's what I'm getting at with this that you have to understand. Moses, when he went on the backside of the desert for 40 years, he meets up. There's basically these gals, and they're at a watering place. These shepherds come. They're giving them problems. Moses comes in, and he saves them, basically, and he waters their sheep and all this. Well, they were the daughters of a Midianite priest. He gives Moses one of the daughters, Zipporah. So now in reading it, it doesn't just come out, but in reading that, what you don't understand and what we don't realize just by glancing through the word is you have to understand the Midianites were pagans. They worshiped several gods. They didn't believe in the God of Moses. And he just brought it into his house. Even Moses was unequally yoked. And it caused problems. He married into that dysfunctional family and relationship because they didn't believe. Now, one of the things, and I'll try to briefly kind of give you this. They had two sons, and what happens is Moses Moses ends up with a problem. I'm going to read it to you here in King James because I think it's most powerful. Moses has a problem because he's got this division in his home. Okay? He ends up, and you have to infer this, you have to get this from the reading. You got to pull it out in the reading. But he's circumcised. Now you remember the covenant, the Abraham covenant, is they had to circumcise the boys. They had to circumcise them on the 8th day. Okay? That's part of the covenant. Moses circumcised one, but he didn't circumcise the other. He didn't circumcise Gershom. Now, it doesn't say this, but here's what you can picture from this. Imagine this whole process, because, they didn't have what we have today for circumcision. Very brutal. And imagine that mom seeing this. And then it's like, all right, you did it, not this one. There was a division there because there was no other reason for Moses not to go ahead and circumcise the other child. That's the thing. And then it all comes to a head. It's time for them to go back to Egypt. Listen to what happens. He's already told them what they're going to do when they get back and all this, and what to tell the Pharaoh. But then it goes on, Exodus 4:24 through 26. And it came to pass, by the way, in the end. Now here's what's happening. They are moving towards Egypt. He's got his sons, he's got his wife Zipporah, and they're moving there. That the Lord met him. Now, that don't sound like a big deal, does it? The Lord met him. The word here is pagash. That's the Hebrew word. What that means, okay, that is a potentially violent encounter. He is meeting God. You remember when Jacob met the angel of the Lord and they wrestled all night? That's what's happening. See, most of you don't even realize this happened to Moses too. Where he's wrestling, because it doesn't come out and say, and Moses wrestled with the angel of the Lord. But that's exactly what's going on. So they met, that the Lord met him. So the Lord met Moses with this potentially violent struggle. He says, and sought to kill him. Do you remember that in Scripture? God was seeking to kill Moses. This is about ready to get bad. And it says, then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son, this is Gershom, and cast it at his feet, and said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. The whole problem here was because Moses hadn't followed the covenant. And they knew immediately, Zipporah knew immediately, to stave off the hand of God from killing Moses. She immediately goes and she cuts the foreskin off and circumcises Gershom. Because she knew what the problem was. The problem was, how do you go to a people and tell them that they have to live under the covenant of God and all about the covenant, and you teach them, and you're not living it in your own home? That's the problem that God had with Moses at this point in time. And it says, and you can see it in her disdain here, it says that she took it, and it says she cast it at his feet. And that's exactly what she did. She cuts off the foreskin, and it's one of those deals like that, where you're part of that blood covenant. Why? Because she has a disdain in her heart because she's pagan. There's division. Because they're unequally yoked. Some of you may already be in that situation. But I'm telling you, and I'm telling you all this to show you that happens. It happened to Moses. He was unequally yoked as well. And actually, if you go through the scriptures and all that, you'll see where Zipporah ends up going back. The boys end up with him and everything else. We don't know if she died, what happened to her. But because of that, and him not being that leader in his home under that covenant, nearly cost him his life. So, I'm saying that to say the bottom line to it. If you're not married, don't end up unequally yoked if you are a solid, hardcore believer. I'm telling you, too many women out there feel like they're always going to be the one that can change him. I can fix him. I can change him. You won't. God has to change him. The Spirit of God has to change him. Same with the other way. Don't be unequally yoked. If you are unequally yoked, dig in. Stand for your beliefs in Christ. Stand in your worship of God. Stand in who you are as a child of God. And don't allow that to sway you or pull you in another direction away from God. I promise you, you will be the one who loses. Stay steadfast with God. Many of us find ourselves struggling in these areas of excuse. But I want you to realize, after this point, when God walks with Moses through these 4 instances of excuses, things began to turn around for Moses. When he became obedient to God, listening to God, moving forward with God, that was the turning point for Moses. And you know what happened when you watch through the plagues and the different things and going to Moses or going to Pharaoh? You see his confidence grow. You see God using him, in different ways. Folks, that will happen to you as well. The more you see God with you and walking with you, and you have to give him that opportunity to, the further you will go in faith, the further you will grow in faith, and the more God can use you because it's the more God can trust you. And just like Moses, things will begin to turn around. And we have to get to that place where we say, God, whatever you're asking, use me in whatever way you've created me to be used for your glory. Send me to do whatever it is you want. Talk to whoever it is you want me to talk to. Show yourself to me in just miraculous ways for me that I just know it's you, God. Because I couldn't have done this or I couldn't have done that. Strengthen me and guide me. Help me with my inabilities. Help me with the things I'm deficient in. Give me that Aaron to come alongside me. To walk through this thing called life with confidence and courage. Because you're following God and you're walking in His Spirit. I'm telling you, your life will change in ways you can never imagine.